As the thunderous applause still echoed through Westridge Auditorium, Amara Brooks stood center stage, the bright lights bathing her in a warm, golden glow. She clutched her violin tightly, feeling a surge of emotions she could hardly contain. She had made it through the most terrifying moment of her life, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was proud. She was free. She was victorious. But just as she began to soak in the unbelievable moment, a sudden commotion near the entrance of the auditorium pulled everyone's attention. The doors swung open with a loud creak, and in marched two uniformed police officers, flanking a woman in a sharp black suit carrying a thick leather folder. The atmosphere in the auditorium shifted immediately. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd as the woman made her way down the aisle with brisk, determined steps. Every eye followed her. Parents sat up straighter. Students leaned in. Teachers froze mid-clap. At the front of the auditorium, Principal Victoria Hale stiffened in her seat, her smile faltering, her face draining of color. Ms. Caroline Foster, sitting rigidly beside her, shot a quick, panicked glance toward the door as if contemplating an escape that was already far too late. The woman stepped onto the stage with calm authority. She introduced herself as the state education inspector and quickly explained that an official investigation into Westridge High had been underway for several weeks following multiple complaints and new evidence brought forward by brave students. Her voice was clear, strong, and unshakable. She detailed that they had uncovered extensive proof of misconduct, including abuse of power, racial discrimination, and intentional acts of harm directed at vulnerable students. And now, with overwhelming evidence in hand, they were taking immediate action. Gasps filled the room. All eyes turned toward Principal Hale and Ms. Foster, who sat frozen in their chairs, trapped under the heavy weight of a truth they could no longer escape. The inspector then addressed them directly, announcing that both women were being officially suspended from their positions, pending legal action and a full criminal investigation. She stated that the school security cameras had captured disturbing footage of Ms. Foster physically forcing a student, Amara, onto a broken chair, causing injury. Multiple students had also come forward with testimonies about the discrimination and cruelty they had endured under Hale and Foster's leadership. The two police officers approached the front row. Hale tried to stand up, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a way to deny, to excuse, to escape, but the officers moved swiftly. One officer read them their rights in a firm but even tone, while the other handcuffed their wrists with sharp metallic clicks that seemed to echo across the silent auditorium. The sight was surreal. The once untouchable Principal Hale, who had ruled Westridge High with an iron grip, now stood before them stripped of all power and dignity. Ms. Foster, who had smirked so often at Amara's pain, now hung her head low, her face pale and trembling. As they were led up the aisle, whispers grew louder. Some students stared in shock, some parents shook their heads in disbelief, and others, more quietly, nodded with grim satisfaction. Justice, so long out of reach, had finally arrived. Amara stood motionless on the stage, her heart pounding for a different reason now. She had dreamed of surviving the concert, of proving them wrong, but she had never imagined this. She had never imagined that standing her ground would light a fire so strong that it would bring real change crashing down upon the people who had tried so hard to crush her. From the third row, Amara caught sight of her mother, Nina Brooks, standing with tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying out of sadness, but out of overwhelming pride. Next to her, Layla Johnson clapped harder than anyone in the room, her smile so bright it could have lit up the entire auditorium. Nearby, Mr. Samuel Hart and Dr. Anthony Rivers stood tall, their faces beaming with pride and approval. As the doors closed behind the disgraced principal and teacher, the inspector turned back to the audience and spoke firmly. She promised that Westridge High would undergo a complete reform, with new leadership focused on fairness, dignity, and respect for every student. The announcement was met with another wave of applause, this one louder, freer, and more joyous than before. Standing on the stage, violin in hand, Amara realized she had not just won her battle tonight. She had helped open a new chapter for every student who had ever felt small, overlooked, or silenced. She had shown them all that even in the face of cruelty, even when the odds seemed impossible, courage and truth could still triumph. In the days that followed the unforgettable night at Westridge High, Amara Brooks's world changed faster than she ever could have imagined. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive one cruel concert had turned into something far greater. Her story spread like wildfire, first across town, then across the state, and before she knew it, her name was appearing on television screens and newspaper headlines across the country. Reporters called her a symbol of courage, a voice for the voiceless, a young girl who had stood up against cruelty and won. It all felt surreal. Amara would sit in her small living room with her mother Nina, holding her breath as anchors spoke about her bravery, her resilience, her astonishing performance. News segments replayed footage of her standing on stage, violin in hand, playing with a raw, aching beauty that had silenced an entire auditorium. More than once, Amara caught sight of Principal Hale and Ms. Foster being led away in handcuffs, their crimes and cruelty exposed for the world to see. But Amara didn't feel vengeful when she saw them. She felt grateful that the truth had finally been set free. One morning, just a few days after the concert, a letter arrived at their front door. It was thick, embossed with the golden seal of the Eastman School of Music. Hands trembling, Amara opened it to find an official scholarship offer inside. A full ride. Tuition, housing, everything covered. At the bottom of the letter, there was a handwritten note from Dr. Anthony Rivers himself. He wrote that Eastman would be honored to have her, not just because of her musical talent, but because of her strength of spirit. Amara cried when she read it. So did her mother. They sat together on the couch, the letter between them, and for the first time in a very long time, the future didn't look so scary. It looked wide open and shining with possibility. The media invitations came next. Amara was invited to speak on talk shows, to give interviews to major magazines, to perform at charity events that supported young musicians from underrepresented communities. She wasn't just a local hero anymore. She had become a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest voice can create a powerful echo if it refuses to be silenced. The story of Amara Brooks reminds us that true strength is not measured by the absence of hardship, but by the courage to keep moving forward when everything feels stacked against you. In life, there will always be people who doubt us, systems that try to silence us, and moments when giving up seems easier than standing tall. But Amara's journey shows that resilience, self-belief, and the support of those who genuinely care can transform even the deepest wounds into powerful victories. Her story teaches us that when we choose to honor our dreams and stand firm against injustice, we not only change our own lives but inspire others to find their own strength as well. For older audiences especially, Amara's experience is a beautiful reminder that it is never too late to reclaim your voice, to fight for dignity, and to become the person you were always meant to be. Whether facing workplace injustice, personal setbacks, or long-buried dreams, the choice to rise above is always within reach. No matter the stage of life, every act of courage, no matter how small, can light the way for those who follow. If this story touched you or reminded you of your own journey, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What life lessons resonated most with you? What inspiring stories would you like to see next? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more powerful and meaningful stories in the future. Your voice matters, and we would love to hear it. Amara Brooks sat quietly at the back of the large school auditorium, her heart pounding against her chest so hard it almost hurt. The chatter of hundreds of students filled the air, but to her, everything sounded distant, muffled by the anxiety swirling in her mind. She shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, trying to ease the sharp pain that shot through her lower back, a painful reminder of an injury she had been trying so hard to hide. She had hoped to just blend into the crowd, to survive the day without drawing any more attention to herself. But fate had something different in store for her. The sudden, sharp voice of Principal Victoria Hale sliced through the noise like a blade. The room fell into instant silence as every head turned to look at the stern woman standing tall at the front of the stage. Principal Hale wore a perfectly pressed cream-colored suit, her blonde hair styled immaculately, her face as cold and rigid as stone. Her piercing gaze swept across the room until it landed on Amara, who immediately froze under the weight of that cruel stare. Hale's eyes narrowed, and in a tone dripping with sarcasm, she called out Amara's name, making sure the entire student body heard it loud and clear. Amara's cheeks burned with humiliation as she felt hundreds of curious and judgmental eyes fixate on her. She wished she could disappear. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward, feeling as though she was walking through quicksand. She tried to explain that she couldn't sit due to her back injury, but her words were barely audible over the low chuckles and murmurs beginning to ripple through the crowd. Principal Hale's expression hardened even more. She marched down the aisle toward Amara, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each step a drumbeat of impending doom. Without warning, Hale snatched the violin that had been leaning against the wall. Layla Johnson's violin, the one Amara had been holding onto for her friend, and thrust it into Amara's shaking hands. Her voice was icy as she declared that, as punishment for her so-called arrogance, Amara would perform a solo at the upcoming spring concert. 3 minutes minimum, in front of the entire school. The auditorium erupted into laughter. Everyone knew Amara had never played a violin before. It was obvious that this was not a real assignment but a cruel joke meant to humiliate her publicly. Amara's hands trembled as she clutched the instrument, her face burning with shame. She tried to protest, to explain that she didn't know how to play, but Hale's sharp glare silenced her immediately. She was given a brutal ultimatum. Either she learned to play and performed at the concert, or she would spend the entire semester in detention. No exceptions. Principal Hale turned her back and walked away with a satisfied smirk, leaving Amara standing alone, clutching the violin like a lifeline and feeling smaller than she ever had before. The students began to file out of the auditorium, some whispering, some openly laughing. Amara stayed frozen in place, unable to move, her mind spinning. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely, refusing to give Hale or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her cry. In that single moment, Amara felt utterly helpless, humiliated, and isolated. It was the worst moment of her young life so far, and she couldn't understand why someone in power could be so cruel. But deep inside, buried beneath the fear and shame, a tiny flicker of something else began to stir. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was more like the stubborn refusal to let this be the end of her story. Amara didn't know it then, but what Principal Hale intended as a crushing blow would eventually become the catalyst for one of the most extraordinary transformations Westridge High had ever seen. And that transformation was going to start with the same violin that now felt so heavy in her trembling hands. Amara Brooks rushed home after school, clutching the violin to her chest as if it were a ticking bomb she didn't know how to defuse. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, burdened not only by the humiliation she had suffered that morning but also by the uncertain weight of what lay ahead. When she finally reached the small house she shared with her mother, she slipped inside quietly, hoping to avoid questions. Her mother, Nina Brooks, was sitting in the living room, quietly knitting by the window. She looked up and smiled warmly at her daughter, but Amara could only muster a weak nod in return before hurrying up the stairs to her room. Behind the safety of her closed door, Amara finally let herself fall to the floor. She sat there for a long moment, the violin resting next to her, her mind whirling with fear, anger, and hopelessness. How was she supposed to learn an instrument in just a few days? How could she possibly avoid the humiliation Principal Hale had so carefully crafted for her? In a fit of frustration, Amara stood up and yanked open the closet door, desperate to change out of her school clothes, desperate to shed the skin of the girl who had been mocked so cruelly. As she pulled out a clean shirt, a battered old shoebox tumbled from the top shelf and hit the floor with a soft thud. Curious despite herself, Amara crouched down and opened it. Inside were a few faded photographs, some old letters, and small keepsakes that smelled faintly of dust and time. She picked up one of the photographs, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. It was a picture of her father, Michael Brooks, beaming under the warm glow of stage lights, a violin cradled lovingly under his chin. His eyes sparkled with joy, completely immersed in the music he was playing. Amara stared at the photograph, her heart aching. She had so few memories of her father. He had passed away when she was just a little girl, leaving a quiet emptiness behind that neither she nor her mother talked about much. Turning the photo over, she noticed a faint inscription written in her mother's handwriting. Michael at his final concert, Eastman School. I wish he hadn't had to give up his passion. Amara's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the words. 1,000 questions raced through her mind. Why had no one ever told her about this? Why had her mother never mentioned that her father had been a musician, much less a violinist? Without thinking, Amara bolted downstairs, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. Nina looked up in surprise as her daughter entered the room, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Amara sat down beside her, showing her the photo. In a trembling voice, she asked if it was true, if her father had really played the violin. Nina's face softened with a mixture of sadness and pride as she took the photo in her hands. She nodded slowly and said yes. Her father had been an exceptionally talented violinist. He had been awarded a full scholarship to the prestigious Eastman School of Music, and was once considered one of the most promising young musicians of his generation. But when life became difficult and Amara was on the way, Michael had made the heartbreaking decision to give up his dreams to support their small family. Amara listened intently, her heart swelling with emotions too big to name. She had always admired her father, but now, learning about his hidden sacrifices, she felt an even deeper connection to him. She realized that the violin Principal Hale had thrown into her hands wasn't just an instrument. It was a symbol of something far bigger. It was a piece of her father's legacy, a dream he had never had the chance to fully realize, now resting quietly in her grasp. Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as she whispered her fears, that she wasn't good enough, that she could never live up to the kind of musician her father had been. Nina gently took her daughter's hands and told her that talent was important, but it was heart, determination, and resilience that truly made someone great. Her father hadn't been defined only by his skill. He had been defined by his passion and his willingness to sacrifice everything for those he loved. Sitting there in the fading afternoon light, Amara felt something shift inside her. The fear that had gripped her so tightly all day began to loosen its hold. She wasn't just doing this to avoid humiliation anymore. She was doing it to honor the father she barely remembered but who had loved her enough to give up everything. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of purpose shining through the fog of fear. She didn't know how she would do it yet, but deep down, she knew she had to find a way to pick up that violin and let her father's dream live on through her. The next morning, Amara Brooks woke up with a new feeling brewing inside her. It wasn't exactly confidence, but it wasn't hopelessness either. It was something in between, something fragile yet persistent. She got dressed quickly and tucked the old photograph of her father into her backpack for good luck before heading off to school. The day passed in a blur of wary glances and whispered gossip, but Amara didn't care as much as she thought she would. She had something to focus on now, something bigger than the stares and the sneers. She had a legacy to honor. At lunch, she sat alone at her usual table, picking half-heartedly at her sandwich when a familiar voice called out. Layla Johnson, her best friend since third grade, dropped her tray down across from Amara and gave her a look that was part concern, part fierce loyalty. Layla had heard the rumors. Everyone had. About the cruel challenge Principal Hale had set. About how Amara was supposed to make a fool of herself at the spring concert. But instead of pity, Layla's eyes sparkled with determination. She leaned in and said that if Amara was willing to try, she would help her every step of the way. Amara's throat tightened with emotion. She hadn't even asked for help yet, but Layla was already there, standing beside her as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It was enough to make Amara believe, just a little, that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had felt yesterday. That afternoon after classes ended, the two girls met up under their favorite old oak tree in the park near their houses. Layla brought her own violin, the one she had been playing since she was 6 years old. She gently showed Amara how to hold the instrument, how to balance it against her shoulder, how to grip the bow. It wasn't easy. Amara's hands were clumsy, her posture stiff, and every mistake echoed in her ears louder than it should have. But Layla was patient, correcting her softly, never laughing, never making her feel small. Still, the physical pain was hard to ignore. Every time Amara raised the violin to her shoulder, the injury on her back flared with sharp, stinging pain. She tried to hide it, to grit her teeth and push through, but Layla noticed. After a particularly painful wince, Layla set her own violin down and asked gently if something was wrong. Amara hesitated at first, embarrassed to admit it, but finally she told Layla about the broken chair, about Miss Foster forcing her to sit on it, about the wound she was trying so hard to ignore. Layla's face darkened with anger. She said Amara should report it, that it was abuse, plain and simple. But Amara shook her head. She knew how it would go. Principal Hale would never side with her. Not against someone like Miss Foster. She needed to survive the concert first. Then, maybe she could think about fighting back. Layla nodded in understanding, her eyes shining with quiet fury, but she didn't push. Instead, she promised they would take it slow, take breaks when needed, and find ways to practice without making things worse. No matter what, she said, they would get through it together. For the next several hours, the park became their private sanctuary. Layla taught Amara simple exercises, open strings, basic bowing techniques. Every small victory, getting a clean sound, holding the bow properly, felt like a mountain conquered. Amara's arms ached, her back throbbed, but a small spark of pride flickered to life inside her with every little success. Just before sunset, as the golden light filtered through the trees, Layla packed up her violin and smiled across the blanket at Amara. She said something Amara would carry with her for a long time. That music wasn't just about skill, it was about heart. If Amara played from her heart, it wouldn't matter that she had only 10 days to prepare. What mattered was the courage it took to even try. Walking home that evening, the violin case bumping lightly against her side, Amara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt strong. Not because she was suddenly good at playing or because the road ahead would be easy, but because she wasn't facing it alone. She had Layla by her side. She had her father's dream in her heart. And somewhere deep inside her, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could turn this impossible challenge into something extraordinary. The days that followed were some of the hardest Amara Brooks had ever lived through. Every morning she woke up sore, her muscles aching from the long hours of practice under the dim streetlights at the park, her back throbbing from the injury she still tried to pretend wasn't there. But each morning, she also woke up determined, clutching the old photo of her father like a shield against everything that was being thrown her way. She was focused. She was ready to fight for her dream. But Principal Victoria Hale and Miss Caroline Foster weren't finished with her yet. On the fourth morning after the humiliating assembly, Amara arrived at school early, violin in hand, hoping to slip into one of the music rooms to practice a little before classes started. But when she reached the hallway where the music department was housed, her heart sank. Every door was locked tight. A brand new notice hung on each one, printed in bold black letters. Music rooms closed after school hours. Permission required from Principal Hale. Amara stood there for a long moment, the weight of the violin case digging into her hand. She knew exactly who was behind this. It wasn't a coincidence. It was another wall thrown up in her path, another way to make her stumble. Still, she refused to let it break her. After school that day, Amara and Layla met up in the park again. They spread out their sheet music under the old oak tree, the streetlights their only illumination as twilight gave way to night. They played until their fingers were stiff and their shoulders ached. When it got too cold, they practiced fingering exercises without bows, silently moving their hands across invisible strings just to keep learning. But the sabotage didn't end with locked doors. Ms. Foster began assigning Amara mountains of extra homework and springing surprise quizzes on her almost every day. While other students enjoyed free periods or light assignments, Amara found herself drowning under essays, complicated math problems, and impossible deadlines. More than once, she stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning just trying to keep up, only to arrive at school the next day exhausted and barely able to keep her eyes open. The cruel part was that no one else seemed to notice. No one else was being pushed this hard. It was deliberate, calculated, and meant to wear her down until she gave up. There were days when Amara thought about quitting. Days when she dragged herself out of bed with every part of her body screaming for rest. Days when she sat in the back of the classroom, feeling her eyelids droop, her heart heavy with the crushing weight of it all. But every time she thought she couldn't take another step, she remembered her father's smiling face in that faded photograph. She remembered Layla's laughter and encouragement, the way Mr. Samuel Hart had adjusted her posture with such careful patience, believing in her even when she couldn't yet believe in herself. Layla noticed the changes in Amara almost immediately. She saw the dark circles under her friend's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. One afternoon as they practiced in the cold wind, Layla set down her violin and made Amara promise to take breaks, to rest when she needed to. Amara agreed, but deep down she knew there wasn't much choice. If she slowed down, even for a day, Hale and Foster would win. And she had decided that she would rather fall down trying than give them the satisfaction of seeing her quit. As the days slipped by and the concert loomed closer, Amara pushed herself harder than she ever thought she could. She played through the pain, practiced through the exhaustion, studied through the tears. She found empty stairwells and quiet corners to rehearse when the music rooms were locked. She wrote essays at lunch, cramming for quizzes between violin drills. Every obstacle Hale and Foster threw at her only added more fuel to the fire burning in her chest. It wasn't about avoiding humiliation anymore. It wasn't even just about making her father proud. It was about proving to herself that no one could define her future but her. Not Principal Hale, not Ms. Foster, not anyone who looked at her and saw only someone easy to break. The weight of the moment settled over Elegance Boutique like a heavy curtain. After Victor Coleman agreed to undergo the training that Ethan Bennett had laid out, the room stayed tense and still. No one quite knew what to say. Employees stood frozen behind their gleaming counters, customers whispered in hushed tones, and the heavy scent of expensive perfumes mixed with the uncomfortable air of reckoning. Ethan didn't rush. He gave everyone time to absorb what had just happened. Accountability wasn't just about a few stern words and an apology. It was about making sure lessons were learned the hard way when necessary. Victor's choice to stay and face the consequences under Olivia's guidance wasn't meant to humiliate him for spectacle. It was meant to force him to truly look at himself, to confront the ugly biases he had let fester unchecked for too long. Ethan stepped forward slightly, making it clear that this wasn't the end of it. He calmly explained that the anti-bias and human dignity training would not be a one-day seminar tucked between coffee breaks. It would be a rigorous, hands-on program designed to change behavior from the inside out. And it wouldn't stop with Victor. Every employee in the store, from managers to new hires, would be required to participate. If anyone refused, they would be let go without hesitation. Ethan's words, delivered without raising his voice, carried a finality that left no room for argument. He wasn't asking for change. He was enforcing it. Lauren Miller shifted uncomfortably, understanding that her earlier behavior would not be forgotten either. Ethan turned to her briefly, locking eyes in a way that sent a clear, unmistakable message. There was no special treatment. Everyone would be held accountable for their actions, no matter how small or hidden behind polite smiles they once were. Olivia remained composed through it all. She didn't gloat, didn't allow herself even a small moment of triumph. That wasn't who she was. She had not come to Rodeo Drive looking for a fight. She had come looking for a meaningful gift, and through an unexpected turn of events, she had ended up giving something even more important to the world around her, a wake-up call. Ethan continued by informing Victor that, in addition to the training, he would personally oversee a new inclusion policy for Elegance Boutique moving forward. That policy would be built from the ground up with Olivia's input, ensuring it wasn't just words in a manual but a living, breathing part of the store's daily operations. Victor nodded stiffly, his pride visibly bruised but his understanding deepened. He knew this wasn't just about saving his job anymore. It was about saving his integrity, if there was still a chance to rebuild it. Ethan paused for a moment, surveying the room, then made one final point. He said that businesses, no matter how luxurious, existed because people trusted them with their time, their attention, and sometimes even their dreams. Treating someone as less simply because they didn't fit a certain mold wasn't just bad for business. It was wrong. Period. No luxury was worth losing humanity over. With those final words, Ethan turned back toward Olivia, giving her a look full of quiet pride and admiration. She had endured so much in such a short time, yet here she stood, stronger and more graceful than anyone else in that glittering boutique. Without fanfare, Ethan offered Olivia his arm. She took it without hesitation, and together, they walked out of Elegance Boutique, leaving behind a silence heavy with lessons that would not be easily forgotten. As they stepped into the sunlight, a small crowd that had gathered outside broke into soft, spontaneous applause. Word of what had happened inside had already begun to spread, and people who once might have looked past the quiet woman in sneakers now looked at her with something different in their eyes. Respect. Understanding. Hope. Olivia smiled quietly, feeling the warmth of Ethan's hand steady at her back. They hadn't just confronted injustice that afternoon. They had planted the seeds of real change. And even if the road ahead remained long and challenging, she knew in her heart they had already made a difference that would ripple out far beyond the golden sidewalks of Rodeo Drive.